In the 17th century, before there were artificial means of transportation, even roads, and barely trails, the easiest way to get around was by the water. And so if you controlled an important point on a water route, you could, in effect, control this whole water highway.
To control the region's lucrative trade in animal furs, the French occupy the mouth of the Niagara River. This sets them in commercial conflict with their European rival, England. To gain the advantage, both nations compete for the friendship of America's greatest empire, the Iroquois Confederacy. In the early 1720s, the French asked local Iroquois for permission to build a house of peace at the river mouth.
It's a PR move. The House of Peace sounds much nicer than a fort to protect ourselves and gain a footage on this portage.
In 1727, French builders complete the three-story stone house. It's a fortified outpost designed to garrison about 40 soldiers and withstand attack by anything short of artillery.
When they are finished, of course, they have staged an incredible coup on the British, and the British are howling in protest that they have established this very formidable house here at a very critical juncture in the transportation and supply routes.
The Great War for Empire, also known as the French and Indian War, began in the wilds of the New World and spread like wildfire throughout the colonies.
This is going to be the last and the greatest of the colonial wars, and will really determine the fate of North American history much more than anything that comes after it.
If they are to rule the continent, the British know they must capture the French fort at Niagara.
In the 1750s, the French are certain that the British will be coming. It's just a matter of when.
To prepare for the inevitable assault, the French spend 3 years strengthening the fort. Finally, in the spring of 1759, thousands of British soldiers march into the New York frontier. Ahead of the troops at Oswego, a British Indian agent named William Johnson convinces nearly 1,000 Iroquois warriors to join the fight.
When the French are finally prepared for this British attack, they've got a fairly respectable garrison. They've got about 600 men.
The British number more than 3,000, yet they're alarmed at what they see. The French commandant, Pierre Pouchot, has created a ring of ditches and earthen walls to protect the fort from cannon fire and attacking infantry.
This is not some tiny little log stockade that is going to just crumble to their artillery. This is a major, major fortification.
Before fighting begins, the British offer the French one last chance to avoid bloodshed. An officer named Rutherford is sent to the French fort to request that Pouchot surrender.
As expected, Pouchot declined, saying in effect that he was expected to render honor to his king and his country, and he was not going to surrender his fortress easily. Well, the business was over at that point, and he could just as easily have sent him back to his lines, but the 18th century was in some ways perhaps a politer time, so he invited Rutherford to breakfast.
Soon, the battle for Fort Niagara would begin in deadly earnest.
And the battle that takes place here in July of 1759 is going to take place right out of a European siege manual. The British idea is going to be to get your cannons closer and closer to the walls of the fort so that you can do more and more damage.
This was done by digging a trench, by literally digging their way toward the fort. And they would dig in a zigzag fashion so that cannon fire from the fort couldn't go straight down their trench. You didn't want to point your trench right at the fort. That was turn it into a death trap.
After 2 weeks of fighting, the defenders are exhausted. On both sides, ammunition is almost gone.
The entire length of the Fort Niagara siege covered about 19 days. That's a very respectable length of time for a fort like Niagara to hold out against a besieging army. In fact, it's one of the longer sieges in the history of North America.
The British capture of Fort Niagara severs the French lifeline to the west. In North America, the Great War for Empire is all but over. the Union Jack would fly over Fort Niagara for the next 4 decades. At 2 corners of the fort, the British built stone towers called redoubts. These small 3-story buildings were forts within a fort. In the spring of 1775, a new rebellion is brewing. Colonists on the eastern seaboard are challenging British rule. During the 8-year War for American independence, Fort Niagara became a sanctuary for those who opposed the Revolution.
During the American Revolution, the Iroquois were very successful by sending small groups into agriculturally productive areas. And New York was the breadbasket, really, of the colonies. And the Indians had a big impact on shutting down farming.
In 1779, the Continental Army would retaliate against the raiders. American forces led by Generals John Sullivan and James Clinton march into Iroquois territory. Though the Loyalist raiders would battle back, the American revolutionaries win the war. Even in victory, the new United States is in no position to force the British off the Great Lakes. It would take 11 years to resolve land claims and treaty disputes before Fort Niagara is finally handed over to the Americans.
When the British finally turned Fort Niagara over to the Americans in 1796, they're very quick to skirt right across the river and build a fort of their own.
Fort George stood only 3/4 of a mile away, across the new border in Canada. Fort George's cannon batteries stand 9 feet higher.
With that 9 feet height differential, the guns of Fort George are able to command the parade ground at Fort Niagara. They're able to fire down into the fort itself.
Over time, the hostility of the American Revolution softens, and relations between the two sides become surprisingly cordial.
The British officers at Fort George, seeking any genteel society, befriended the American officers at Fort Niagara, and they would get together for shooting expeditions and have dinner together on one side or the other and that sort of thing.
But as a new century progressed, tensions between the nations would escalate and threaten the peace at Niagara. In June of 1812, the U.S. Congress, angered over violations of national sovereignty, declares war on Britain. When the news reaches the Niagara frontier, neither the Americans nor the British are prepared.
When word of the declaration of war arrived, there were several American officers from Fort Niagara who were having dinner with their British opposite numbers in the mess at Fort George.
You can imagine everyone jumping up and wine bottles knocked over as the Americans are perhaps more than a little concerned that they're on enemy territory. But according to the story, the officer in charge of the mess says, "Gentlemen, please be seated. Let's not let bad news ruin a good dinner."
They finished the meal in apparently cordial circumstances, and the U.S. officers were then allowed to return to Fort Niagara.
In October, cordial relations turned to conflict. In support of a land invasion by American troops, Niagara's batteries fire on Fort George. The British return fire, and with their height advantage, pulverize Fort Niagara. The costly lesson forces the Americans to make changes.
They do a number of things, not the least of which is to remove the roof from the stone house, the French castle, and turn the top floor into an elevated gun deck.
The alterations came just in time. On November 21st, Fort George's cannons again fire on Fort Niagara. The Americans return fire with heated cannonballs, hoping to start fires at Fort George. Finally, in the spring of 1813, Fort Niagara's cannons and the guns of an American naval squadron all but destroy Fort George.
While the campaign starts out very optimistically for the American Army with the capture of Fort George in May of 1813, things tend to turn sour after that.
By December 10th, the regular American forces have pulled out, and Fort George is left in the hands of restless militiamen ready to do the same.
The Americans decided to abandon the Canadian side, retreat back to the eastern shore, and in doing so burned not only the remnants of Fort George, but the entire town of Newark.
In retaliation, 562 British soldiers launch a daring nighttime assault on Fort Niagara. Using their bayonets, the British force their way inside. On this night, the American garrison is completely caught off guard. 3 columns of British soldiers methodically attack each of the American strongholds. Small groups of defenders put up stiff resistance. But in less than 30 minutes, it was all over. 340 American soldiers became prisoners of war. 65 lay dead.
The British had achieved a major military victory and a trove of equipment.
The Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812, and Fort Niagara is returned to the Americans. The fort has seen its last shots fired in anger.
The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 and the Welland Canal shortly thereafter, in one single blow, eliminate 150 years of geographic and military significance for Fort Niagara.
The French know the British are coming. This is obviously a major fort in North America. The French decide that the French castle alone will not do it, so they send to France for a regiment. 500 French soldiers who come and by hand over the course of 10 months dig out a star-shaped fortification, classic European style. Why star-shaped? Because no matter what angle you try to attack it, the defenders can shoot at you from 2 different sides. It's not anything unique. It's been used that way for 200 years in Europe. Everybody knows about it. When the British land about 4 miles up on Lake Ontario, they send scouts forward, expecting a full report that all there is the French castle from 1725. They come back and go, you are not going to believe this, boss, but we got a major fortification to assault. British commander is not surprised, is not worried about it, no big deal. He knows that this whole area is cleared of everything. Trees, no tree stumps, nothing, because the French defenders don't want anybody to be able to sneak up, use cover, and concealment. The British start a zigzag trench about 1,000 yards out, end up right about by the end of the maintenance barn behind me. Over the course of 19 days, they are bombarding the fort night and day. Now, the normal siege lasted about 2 to 3 days, so 19 days is incredible. Ultimately, the French surrender. The commander has written in his diary, his journals, that the men are going mad. They've had no sleep. They've got plenty to eat, but they're 1 in 10 muskets is working, and they have no large caliber cannonballs, 12 or 24 pound cannonballs at all. It's disaster. So he surrenders. Because it's such a long siege, the British commander allows the French to leave the fort flying their colors, and he allows them to keep their flag. Not a surrender flag, that's their flag. When the British come back in the War of 1812 and capture the fort from the Americans in less than 30 minutes, the flag in the museum that you saw, we didn't get to keep it. They kept it as a war trophy. We never earned the respect, the honor of being able to keep our flag. The British captured the fort in 1770, 5 years before the American Revolutionary War. They built the South Redoubt. A year later, the North Redoubt. Redoubt just means fort within a fort. 1720s of a French officer coming from Montreal by boat to Fort Niagara. It was 400 miles. He reports that it took him 3 weeks by boat. Sounds like a long journey. He says on that same trip, to get the 8 miles around Niagara Falls, took him 2 weeks. So 400 miles in 3 weeks by boat, 8 miles in 2 weeks by foot. You want to go by boat or foot? It makes far more sense to go by water whenever you can. It wasn't just the 180-foot escarpment that he had to go up to get around the falls, but there were no roads, there were forests, and there were bad people in the woods who didn't want you to be there. So if you could take your boat out 100 yards offshore, You're out of bow and arrow range. Muskets aren't really effective much beyond 100 yards. Nobody's going to shoot a cannon at a canoe. If you get something bigger, maybe. Okay, now, why here? In the 1700s, an artillerist, somebody who fires cannons, would be expected to hit a 4-foot by 4-foot target 10 times out of 10 at half a mile. So it's half a mile across from here to what's now Canada. If you're French and you set up artillery here, you control access up or downriver to the interior of North America from this point here. Now you could move the fort further up the river if you wanted, it's still half a mile across, but this location has the advantage of Lake Ontario to its rear, where you can get resupplied and you're not cut off by land on either side. So this is truly an ideal place to put a fort. The British knew it, that's why they attacked, and after they took it, they used it for the same function as that Walmart or Amazon distribution for all those what used to be French forts that are now British forts. Revolutionary War ends. Americans think they won, and what do they tell the British? Go home. And the British say, no, come and chase us out if you want. That's almost 400 miles to New York City from here. George Washington's Continental Army is gone. They've gone back to their farms and their families. They've been fighting for all these years. The war is done. Nobody's going to come through the wilderness and push the British out, and they know it. So the garrison stays. And there have been all kinds of loyalists who came from New York and Pennsylvania, particularly for the protection of the garrison, and Native American allies who came here too. They're all here. It took 13 years of diplomacy before the diplomats finally decided the boundary between the U.S. and what's now Canada is halfway down the river up on both sides and halfway up the Great Lakes on either side. Revolutionary War plus 13 years, the British garrison and their allies leave here, go across to Canada. Now, there were British soldiers already over there and what we would call Canadians over there already, but the main force was here. They went across. Within a couple of years, they built Fort George. See the long white warehouse over there? Keep going left with your eye up through the tree line, you'll see a flagpole with a flag on it. It should be flying this flag. That's Fort George. Social exchanges. Their surgeons went over and treated our sick soldiers. We went over there for religious services. And guess what? The War of 1812 comes. Now we have to kill each other. And there are artillery bombardments back and forth. And ultimately, in December of 1813, the British come across the middle of the night, capture Fort Niagara, killing 65 and capturing about 300 soldiers. So, the British are here through the war. The War of 1812 ends. Then we go back basically to the way to all these wars. This was the original entranceway when the French were here. 5 cannons ahead, they would shoot grape or canister shot like a bucket full of musket balls. Not shooting a solid shot half a mile across. It's shooting for 100 or 150 yards, but anything in its path, like a supersized shotgun, is in trouble. Maybe why the British decided to do their zigzag trench on the other side over there. Was there a drawbridge here in 1740? Yes, there was. Was there a gatehouse here for the drawbridge? Yes, but the gatehouse was wood. That's the only thing we know about it.
Sorry.
Imagine a 2-story wooden structure behind you here, essentially where the stone structure is. It would hold up to 7,000 casks, barrels of everything you needed to eat, fight, trade, do everything on the frontier. Everything except gunpowder. Gunpowder would have been stored in the powder magazine. The powder magazine could hold 50 tons of gunpowder. They were not kidding around here. They were really serious about supporting the forts in themselves. Remember, not just for this fort, but all those other forts. When the British took over, ultimately the wooden structure was dilapidated. The British built a 2 1/2 story stone structure. We've been able to preserve a story and a half. trade would not actually have happened inside the castle. You don't invite your potential enemy to look around where you're going to have a defensive position. So there would have been a stockade. Trade would have happened outside. We can't keep going back and forth inside, outside, that sort of stuff. So we have a candy shop set up there. This guy's basketball gunpowder wrapped in paper.
I am dressed as a British Grenadier in the 46th Regiment of Foot. Okay? Let's start with the rhetorical question. Who here thinks it's a really good idea to stand in a long straight line and let other people shoot at them? Well, if you understand this gun, it makes perfect sense, all right? And I'll get back to that in 1 second. I'll explain the uniform real quickly. It is a Grenadier's uniform. This is called a miter cap, and it does a whole bunch of things, okay? Grenadiers throw hand grenades. If I had a three-cornered hat on, when I threw the grenade, I'd knock my hat off. So that's the first thing. Okay. Second thing, pom-pom. See that? If you're a British soldier and you see the pom-pom, the guy in front of you has explosives on his head, so you run away from them as much as possible, okay? And then last thing, it allows me to swing my gun over my hat so I can throw the grenade. So it has many positive things about it. Look at the back, it's got a great big bomb, just in case you're not sure what's going on, right? The uniform's all wool, you get to wear it all year long, okay? This thing right here, that's a match case. It holds a fuse for lighting the grenade. By 1750, they had stopped letting grenadiers throw grenades. You see a problem here? Okay, I got a bomb in my hand and I got a fuse up here. And I can't see what I'm doing, okay? If I short light the fuse, it explodes in my hand. And so more grenadiers are getting killed by their own bombs than the other guys, so they stopped using them. They continued to use grenades on ships up until 1812, because on a ship you can sit here and look at it and light it and throw it, right? At my side, I'm carrying a sword, which is referred to as a hanger, okay? See it? Meaning it's a useless lump of iron that hangs on your hip. They don't even sharpen it. If you have to use it, you beat the other guy to death with it, okay? So that's why it's a hanger. And in addition to that, I've got a bayonet, right? These protect my socks from being ripped up in bad situations like in woods or things like that. And that's kind of the kit of the time. Cartridge box here. I should have a haversack over here, which I didn't bring out with me. What I'm carrying is a smoothbore flintlock musket. It's very, 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 very inaccurate, okay? Very hard to hit anything with this gun. So how do they make it effective? Line up lots of people and everybody shoots at the same time. At 100 yards, 1 in 10 people actually hit things, right? And that's pretty inaccurate, right? And the reason for that is this is a 75 caliber bore. The ball is 69 caliber. And what happens when you shoot it, it goes boom, 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 boom. When it hits the end, it ricochets all over the place. And every once in a while, it goes exactly where you want it to. But that's luck, right? What makes it work right here is that is flint. And that's a stone that's actually harder than this piece of steel. When you pull the trigger, this should fly forward, hit this, knock it out of the way, and it should cut little pieces of steel off. Those little pieces of steel should light the powder. Should light the powder, okay? All right. Then the powder here should explode. The explosion goes through a hole, hits more powder, there should be a second explosion, and then the ball rattles out of the gun and you miss what you're aiming at, okay? Except that, right? Okay, so that's shoot stuff. If the flint gets rather dirty, no friction, you have to wipe this off about every 7 or 8 shots. Otherwise, there's so much fouling here, it doesn't create a spark, right? Number 2, the wind. The wind is a problem. The wind will blow the sparks away from the gun. And we are not talking a hurricane here. We're talking 17, 18 miles an hour. They start to misfire. And number three, they don't work in wet weather. So early 19th century, you don't fight in the wind, rain, sleet, snow, Thursday, that doesn't work. However, at that time, this is the most modern, up-to-date gun. Now, why not use a rifle gun? Rifles are expensive. They're slow to load. They take a minute or more to load. And rifle guns usually fire about 25 times before they build up so much soot they turn into a musket anyway, so why bother? And they don't shoot often enough, they don't shoot fast enough, and they're 3 times as expensive. So if you're in a modern army, you want muskets. Okay? And that's true right up until about 1840. Over here, I've got a cartridge box. Yeah, this is a paper cartridge, rolled up paper cylinder, ball in the bottom, powder on top, one-step operation, okay? To get it open quickly, you're going to bite it with your teeth. To be a soldier, you need 2 teeth. And the teeth must oppose each other. So you get a tooth there. And at this fort, there was actually a gentleman in the 8th Regiment of Foot who lost so many teeth in the front, they had to let him go. He just couldn't rip open cartridges, right? Next thing you need, 4 fingers. Yeah, a thumb and an opposing finger is sufficient to work gun and cartridge. You don't need 10. All right, good eyesight. Nope. You just point the damn thing and pull the trigger and hope for the best, okay? And last thing, you don't need to read and write. So that said, you've got 2 teeth, 4 fingers, you're blind, you're illiterate, you're perfect for this job, okay? All right. I'm going to put some powder here. That's the prime. I'm going to shut this. That keeps the powder from falling out. Okay, that's called a hammer in a British gun. Cast the weapon about, and I'm going to dump the rest of the cartridge down the muzzle. So ball powder and paper go in. What's the paper do? It stops the ball from rolling back down the tube. Okay, and that's referred to as a wad. This is the rammer, and the whole process should take 15 seconds or less. Really hard to do, and to achieve that they practice every single day except Sunday. The first command is to make ready. We're going to compress the spring, the cock back. Then the second command is going to be, anybody? Amy doesn't do any good, folks. The next command is present. You just present the gun, and then you pull the trigger, okay? I'll try to do it on 3, and as a side note, only the crazy Americans say aim the gun, and the British think it's humorous. So that said, the first command is to make ready. Second command is to present. 1, 2, 3. Now imagine every 15 seconds, 700 guns go off. So there is smoke everywhere. That's the fog of war. It's very hard to see in these battles. So how do you avoid shooting your friends and all that smoke? You wear a bright red sport coat. That's what the coat's about, all right? This coat's about being seen. You're more afraid of the people who are 5 yards behind you than the people shooting at you. What's that say about accuracy, okay? If the guys behind you don't see you, they shoot, they're not going to miss at 5 or 10 yards, all right? So you wear bright clothing. All right, so they shoot, you shoot, they shoot, you shoot, they shoot. And what, it looks like, kind of like a tennis match. You be volleying and volleying, and what's the deal? The people behind you, your commanders, are evaluating how those people are doing. If they see the people across the field making mistakes, they will tell you to simply drive them off the field. They're no good, all right? What's a mistake? Well, they're firing and not listening. They're not going together. They're firing as fast as they can. They're not staying where they should be. Oh, this is good. No, it's a little better back here. I like the, that sort of thing. At which point, you will take this out, and this is the socket bayonet, and it's scarier than the gun, believe it or not, right? Always made in a triangular configuration. So what that does is it makes the blade very strong. However, if you stab someone with a triangular blade, it makes the surgeons, doctors' operation very difficult because it tends to tear open. No plain bandaging, no antiseptic, no antibiotics, but they do have raging infections. So even a hand wound is very likely to be fatal. Next thing, oh, if you fire repeatedly, it's all full of black soot. If you stab someone, that soot is in the wound, all right? It's made from charcoal, sulfur, saltpeter. Charcoal is burnt wood. Sulfur is an element dug out of the ground. It's got dirt in it sometimes. And last thing, potassium nitrate is saltpeter. Where does that come from? Boiled manure. Yeah, that's not conducive to healthy wounds, okay? Last thing, the blade's kept razor sharp. See? The blade is never sharpened. Dull blades tear bigger holes. So that said, when 1,000 people start walking towards you, what do you do?
Bye-bye.
Take a good soldier. That's what happens. You run away and you live to fight again another day, all right? You know, the officers tell you not to do that, but you know better. So they're only coming at you because you've been messing up for 5 or 6 minutes, and it's time to get out of it. All right, according to the British infantry, only 3 types of people are ever killed by the bayonet. They are the bravest soldiers in the regiment. They are the stupidest soldiers in the regiment. The last one is they are the slowest soldiers in the regiment, okay? So that said, are there any questions?
Yeah, I was curious about your uniform. Wool, is it break in and get comfortable, or is it just always terrible to wear? Is it?
Number one, you get used to it, which is, when you start the job, it takes a couple weeks. Number two, on a hot day, it will soak the entire uniform, at which point it becomes like a thermos, and you actually are more comfortable wet, all right? Forget taking it off. It's really hard to take off. But yeah, it's incredibly uncomfortable. And this one is about 11 pounds of wool right now. You get to wear it all year long, right?
I do.
If you have a question, I will be in the guard room and I will make things up for you, okay? Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Jumbo oven for their tea. These right here are very big pieces.
Pew! Pew! Attack them! Shoot! Pew! 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 John, the thing!
What, the sailboats?
It's too risky!